Alaric Voss had always believed that a king must never let his heart make decisions. That was the rule he lived by. That was the rule he repeated to himself the morning he stood at the altar, dressed in iron-gray ceremonial robes, waiting for a bride he had chosen not out of love, but out of necessity. Her name was Saraphene Caldwell. She walked down the aisle with perfect posture and a calm, unreadable expression. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Polished, deliberate, impressive. She came from a powerful family. Her father controlled 3 northern trade routes. Her brother commanded the largest private army in the Upper Territories. A marriage to her meant stability. It meant alliance. It meant survival for a kingdom that was slowly being squeezed from all sides. Alaric watched her approach and told himself he had made the right decision. He almost believed it. What he did not speak of, not to his council, not to his mother, not to a single soul in that decorated hall, was the girl he had turned away 3 years before. Her name was Lena Morrow. She had been 17 when he first felt it. That quiet, undeniable pull that every wolf knows, and most spend their whole lives hoping to find. The bond, the thread that the universe ties between 2 people and says, this one. He had been 22, newly crowned, freshly terrified, though he would never have admitted it. He had seen her across a crowded pack gathering in the border village, a small, soft-spoken Omega girl with dark eyes and steady hands, and he had felt the thread pull tight in his chest. And then he had taken a breath, straightened his spine, and looked away. His chief advisor had been beside him. The man had seen his king's jaw tighten and had said, very quietly, "She is not suitable, Your Majesty, not for a king." And Alaric, who was young and afraid and dressed in armor that was still too large for him, had nodded once and walked in the other direction. Lena had been transferred to a distant province 2 weeks later, under the pretense of a border reassignment. No one explained why, no one asked. She had simply disappeared from court records, from conversations, from memory. Alaric had told himself, over the following years, that he had forgotten her. He had almost managed it too. The first 3 years of his marriage to Saraphene were, by most measures, a success. She was sharper than anyone he had ever worked with. She restructured Ironmore's failing trade agreements within the first 6 months. She negotiated peace with 2 rival packs that had been circling his eastern border for years. She sat in council meetings and said very little, but what she said always landed with precision. The other lords respected her. Some feared her. Alaric respected her too, and he was honest enough to admit that was more than he had expected. On the night of their wedding, they had spoken plainly to each other. There was no pretending. They were partners in power, not in heart. They would govern together. They would present a united front, and if love was not part of the arrangement, then neither of them would pretend otherwise. It was a cold agreement, but it was an honest one. Alaric expanded his kingdom's influence through those years. He won 2 wars. He signed 4 major treaties. He became the kind of ruler that other kings mentioned carefully, as though speaking too freely about him might attract his attention. He was not cruel, but he was formidable. He had built that reputation deliberately, one decision at a time. He did not think of Lena. Not until the morning he arrived at the Pan-Kingdom Summit and took his seat at the Great Hall of the Meridian Palace. The summit was held every 10 years. All ruling monarchs of the werewolf territories attended. It was where borders were renegotiated, trade agreements were reviewed, and old tensions were either resolved or quietly sharpened for the next decade. Alaric had attended twice before and found both occasions tedious but necessary. He was reviewing documents with his senior advisor when the southern doors of the Great Hall opened for the final arriving delegation. The announcement came in the clear, formal voice of the palace herald. Presenting Her Majesty, Queen Alara of the Solene Crown, ruler of the Southern Reach, protector of the free Omegas, and alpha-bonded mate of the late King Dorian Solene. Alaric did not look up immediately. He was mid-sentence on a trade clause. He finished the sentence, set the document down, and then raised his eyes toward the entrance, the way any attentive host would. She walked in, dressed in deep gold and midnight blue, the Solene crown resting on her head like it had been made specifically for her. Her posture was unhurried. Her expression was composed. She moved through the room with the quiet, natural authority of someone who was completely comfortable in her own power, not performing it, simply living inside it. Her dark eyes swept the hall in a single, calm sweep. Alaric stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds. He knew those eyes. Lena. The name arrived in his mind before his brain had fully caught up with what he was seeing. His chest pulled tight, that same old thread, still there, still alive, as though it had been waiting patiently all this time. His hands, resting on the table, were very still. Saraphene, seated beside him, glanced at his face. She said nothing, but her eyes sharpened slightly, and he knew she had noticed. He forced himself to breathe normally. He forced his expression back to neutral. And he watched, as calmly as he could manage, as Lena Morrow, Queen Alara of the Solène Crown, crossed the hall, took her seat at the summit table, and greeted the rulers around her with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. Because she had been. What Alaric did not know, what he had never thought to find out, was the life that Lena had built in the years since he had looked away from her. She had left the border province with almost nothing. No title, no protection, no explanation for why she had been sent away. She had been heartbroken in the private, quiet way of someone who carries their pain without making it anyone else's burden. She had grieved the bond in silence, because what else was there to do? You cannot hold someone who does not want to be held. But Lena Morrow had always had a remarkable mind. It had simply never been in a room where anyone noticed. She made her way south. She worked first as a healer's assistant in a small Solène village, then as a translator for a trade delegation, then, because her instincts for people and her memory for detail were genuinely extraordinary, as a senior court aide in the Solène palace. It was there that she met King Dorian Solène. He was older, a widower. He ruled the southern territories with a kind of tired, careful fairness that his people deeply valued. He had no interest in political theater. He was interested in results, in honesty, and in people who could think clearly, without needing to be the loudest voice in the room. Lena was all three. Their relationship began as professional. Then, slowly, it became something else. Not the electric pull of a fated bond, but a quieter and perhaps more durable thing. A friendship that deepened into genuine love, built from years of shared work, honest conversation, and mutual respect. Dorian had seen her clearly from the beginning, in a way that no one in Ironmore had ever bothered to. When his health began to decline, he brought her before his court and named her, not just his mate and his queen, but his equal and his heir. He spent his remaining years teaching her everything he knew about governance, diplomacy, and the long, slow work of keeping a people safe. When he passed, the Solène kingdom mourned him deeply. And then they turned to Queen Alara, and they followed her. She abolished the Omega classification system in the south within her first year, a system that had quietly oppressed her people for generations. She rebuilt the southern trade networks. She established the Free Omega Accord, a formal agreement protecting Omega rights across the territories, and spent 3 years personally traveling to other kingdoms to gather signatures. She had done all of it without Ironmore, without Alaric, without once looking over her shoulder. They were seated across the table from each other for the full 3 days of the summit. There was no avoiding it. The seating arrangement placed the Solène delegation directly across from Ironmore, and so Alaric spent those days doing something he had not done in years, sitting with a consequence he could not negotiate his way out of. When she finally spoke to him directly, it was on the first afternoon. She looked across the table with clear, steady eyes and said, "Alpha King Alaric, I hope the Northern delegation has had a chance to review the Free Omega Accord. I'll be requesting a vote on ratification before the summit closes." Her voice was calm, her tone was professional. There was no anger in it, no old wound, no trembling edge of something unspoken. She simply looked at him, the way she looked at every other ruler at the table, as a colleague, as a peer, as someone whose cooperation she required, and whose feelings she had no particular interest in managing. It was the most devastating thing she could have done, because it told him, more clearly than any confrontation could have, that she had moved through the pain and come out the other side, into something he had never given her the chance to share with him. She was not performing indifference. She had genuinely arrived at peace. And he was simply one of many rulers she needed to work with. That night, Alaric stood on the balcony of his summit suite and looked out at the darkened grounds for a long time. He turned things over slowly, the way he turned over military strategies and trade proposals, methodically, looking for the point where it had gone wrong. But the honest answer was simple, and it did not require much analysis. He had been afraid. He had been 22 years old and newly crowned and deeply afraid of anything that felt too large to control. And Lena had felt very large. The bond had felt very large. Love, at that age, with those stakes, had felt like an opening, and he had spent his whole young life learning that openings were where you got hurt. So he had closed it. Neatly, quickly, and at her expense, not his own. He had told himself it was wisdom. He had dressed fear in the language of strategy and called it a decision. Saraphene found him there sometime after midnight. She had been perceptive enough to piece together the broad shape of what had happened, even without him explaining it. She sat beside him in the dark and looked out at the grounds. After a while, she said, "She is extraordinary." He did not deny it. Saraphene looked ahead and added, quietly, "I've always known you were holding something closed. I didn't ask because it wasn't my place." A pause. "But don't let your regret become her burden. She has built something that does not need your recognition to be real." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to him. And it was exactly correct. The vote on the Free Omega Accord came on the third morning. 8 kingdoms signed, 1 abstained. The room turned to Ironmore last. Alaric looked at the document in front of him. It was thorough, carefully written, and just. He had known that before he sat down. He had read it twice the evening before. He had no real objection to any part of it. He looked up once, across the table. Lena, Queen Alara, was watching him with the same steady, patient expression she had worn all week. She was not pleading. She was not hopeful in any soft, exposed way. She simply waited, the way a person waits who has learned that outcomes do not change based on how much you want them. He picked up the pen and signed. She gave him a single nod, clean, brief, professional. The acknowledgement one ruler offers another when the right decision has been made. Nothing more. He had half expected something more. He understood, in the silence that followed, that he had no right to it. He returned to Ironmore and spent the following year doing something he had long ignored, looking clearly at his own kingdom. The Omega classification system in the north was not as severe as it had been elsewhere, but it existed, and it created quiet, persistent damage in the lives of people he was responsible for. He brought Saraphene into the reform work, expecting resistance. Instead, she threw herself into it with a focus that surprised him. One evening, working late over reform documents, she looked up and said, without particular emotion, "I grew up watching my mother navigate a court that saw her as a political tool. I understand more than you assume." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why didn't you ever say so?" She shrugged once, the smallest movement. "Because you never asked." It was a fair answer. He had not asked. He had not asked about a great many things that mattered. Their partnership changed after that. Not into something dramatic or romantic. They were too similar in their guardedness for that. But into something warmer and more honest. A real alliance, at last, between two people who had spent years being useful to each other, without ever being fully present. 3 years later, Alaric read in the summit dispatches that the Free Omega Accord had been ratified by every territory in the known kingdoms. He read that Queen Alara of the Selene Crown had been honored by a formal portrait commission, the first former Omega ever depicted in the Selene Hall of Legacy Rulers. He set the dispatch down on his desk and sat with it quietly for a while. He did not write to her. There was nothing he needed to say that she needed to hear. The years had settled into their proper shape, and disturbing them served no one. But he commissioned something that week, a wing of the Ironmore Palace archives dedicated to the history of Omega leadership across all territories, through all recorded generations. A place where the people who had always been overlooked would be permanently remembered. He named it after the year the accord passed. It was the only apology he could offer that did not ask anything of her in return. She never knew about it. Perhaps that was the correct way for it to be. Some things are not meant to be received. They are simply meant to be done, quietly, honestly, and far too late. A man learning, at last, to do right by people who had moved on without him. A king, understanding, finally, that the most important decisions he had ever made were not the treaties or the wars or the alliances. They were the ones he had been too afraid to make when it still would have mattered.